The rain drummed against the recruiting station windows as Sarah Martinez stood in line, her small frame barely reaching the shoulders of the men around her. At 19, she looked even younger, with wide brown eyes that held a determination most people couldn't see past her nervous fidgeting. The recruiting sergeant glanced up from his paperwork and barely suppressed a sigh when he saw her approaching his desk. "Ma'am, are you looking for someone?" he asked, assuming she was there to visit a boyfriend or brother. Sarah straightened her shoulders. "I want to enlist, sir." The sergeant looked her up and down, taking in her 5'2" frame and the way her oversized jacket seemed to swallow her whole. "The Army's not summer camp, sweetheart. Maybe you should think about the Peace Corps or teaching." But Sarah had already thought about everything. She had grown up in East Los Angeles, where opportunities were as scarce as quiet nights. Her father had worked double shifts at the factory until his back gave out, and her mother cleaned office buildings until her hands cracked and bled. Sarah had watched them struggle, had seen the pride in their eyes when she became the first in her family to graduate high school, and had felt the weight of their hopes pressing down on her shoulders like a lead blanket. The military represented something different. It offered structure, purpose, and, most importantly, a chance to prove that she was more than what people saw when they looked at her. She had researched every branch, every job classification, every possible path that could lead her away from the cycle of poverty that had trapped her family for generations. "I've already taken the ASFOB," she said quietly, sliding her test scores across the desk. "I scored in the 95th percentile." The sergeant's eyebrows rose as he scanned the numbers. High intelligence scores like these usually belong to college-bound kids from suburban families, not young women who looked like they needed permission to speak above a whisper. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "What made you want to join up?" Sarah thought about the night she had found her father sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills with tears in his eyes. She thought about her mother's hands, raw from industrial cleaning chemicals, and the way her younger brother looked at her like she might have answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "I want to serve," she said simply. "I want to make a difference." The processing took weeks. Sarah endured the medical examinations, the background checks, and the endless paperwork that seemed designed to wear down anyone without serious commitment. Her family reacted with a mixture of pride and terror. Her mother lit candles in church every day, praying for her daughter's safety in a world she didn't understand. Her father said nothing but hugged her tighter each night at dinner. The neighborhood's reaction was less supportive. Friends from high school shook their heads and whispered about how Sarah was making a terrible mistake. Military service was for other kinds of people, they said, people who had fewer options or different dreams. Sarah was smart enough for college, pretty enough to find a good husband, small enough to disappear into a normal life without making waves. But Sarah had never wanted to disappear. Even as a child, she had felt restless in ways she couldn't explain. While other girls played house, she had built elaborate forts in her backyard and organized neighborhood kids into complex games that resembled military operations. She had devoured books about historical battles, famous generals, and ordinary soldiers who had done extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March. Sarah tore it open with shaking hands while her mother hovered nearby, clutching her rosary. The words swam on the page at first, then snapped into focus. Basic training, Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Report date, April 15th. 6 weeks, Sarah whispered. "I leave in 6 weeks." Her mother burst into tears. Her father nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. Sarah folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her wallet, where it would stay during the long weeks of preparation ahead. Those final weeks at home passed in a blur of shopping for items from the packing list, awkward conversations with relatives who couldn't understand her choice, and quiet moments of doubt that crept in during the early morning hours when the house was still and her mind was free to wander. Sarah's high school guidance counselor called to ask if she had reconsidered college applications. Her best friend begged her to wait another year, to think things through more carefully. Even strangers felt compelled to offer advice when they learned about her plans. "The military's no place for a girl like you," said the woman behind the counter at the local grocery store. You're too soft, too small. They'll eat you alive. But Sarah had never felt soft. She had felt overlooked, underestimated, and occasionally invisible, but never soft. There was something hard and bright burning in her chest that had been there for as long as she could remember, something that wanted to test itself against real challenges and prove its worth in ways that mattered. The night before she left, Sarah walked through her neighborhood one last time. She passed the corner where she had learned to ride a bike, the playground where she had organized elaborate games of capture the flag, and the church where her family had celebrated every major milestone of her life. Everything looked smaller than she remembered, as if the world had shrunk to make room for bigger dreams. At the airport, her parents cried openly. Her father pressed a small silver cross in her hand, the same one he had carried during his own brief stint in the National Guard decades earlier. Her mother whispered prayers in Spanish and made her promise to call every chance she got. "Make us proud, Mija," her father said, using the childhood nickname that always made her feel simultaneously grown up and very young. "I will, Papa. I promise." The flight to Missouri was Sarah's first time on an airplane. She pressed her face to the window and watched the patchwork landscape spread out below her like a map coming to life. Other recruits filled the plane, most of them young men who seemed to take up enormous amounts of space with their loud conversations and confident laughter. Sarah listened to them talk about their motivations, their fears, and their expectations. Some were following family traditions, continuing legacies that stretched back generations. Others were running from troubles at home, or seeking adventure they couldn't find in their small towns. A few, like Sarah, were reaching for something they couldn't quite name but knew they needed to find. "First time flying?" asked the young man in the seat next to her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that Sarah had always envied. His name tag read Johnson, and his accent suggested somewhere in the deep South. "Yes," Sarah admitted. "First time doing a lot of things." Johnson laughed, not unkindly. "Well, you picked a hell of a way to start. Basic training's going to be rough." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "I'm ready." Johnson looked at her more carefully, taking in her slight frame and serious expression. "You sure about that? No offense, but you look like you should be heading to college, not boot camp." It was a comment Sarah had heard dozens of times in the past few weeks, but something about hearing it from a fellow recruit stung more than usual. She turned back to the window without responding, watching clouds drift past like cotton balls scattered across an endless blue canvas. The bus ride from the airport to Fort Leonard Wood was filled with nervous energy and increasingly desperate attempts at humor as the reality of their situation began to sink in. Sarah sat quietly in the back, clutching her small travel bag and trying to memorize every detail of the experience. She wanted to remember this moment, this feeling of standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. The base appeared gradually through the bus windows, a sprawling complex of identical buildings and perfectly manicured grounds that looked nothing like the neighborhood where Sarah had grown up. Everything was organized, purposeful, and somehow both intimidating and reassuring at the same time. "Listen up," shouted the drill sergeant who boarded the bus as soon as it stopped. He was exactly what Sarah had expected, and somehow worse, a compact bundle of controlled aggression with a voice that could strip paint. "You have 30 seconds to get off this bus and form up in 4 ranks. Anyone who takes longer than 30 seconds gets to enjoy some extra physical training tonight. Move." The controlled chaos that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Recruits stumbled over each other in their haste to comply, their civilian confidence evaporating in the face of military authority. Sarah found herself swept along in the crowd, her small size both an advantage and a liability as she navigated between much larger bodies. She managed to find a spot in the formation just as the drill sergeant finished, counting down from 5. Around her, other recruits breathed heavily and tried to look like they had everything under control. Sarah kept her eyes forward and concentrated on standing as straight and still as possible. "Welcome to Fort Leonard Wood," the drill sergeant announced, his voice carrying across the formation like a thunderclap. "For the next 10 weeks, This place is going to be your home, your school, and your personal version of hell. Some of you will make it through. Some of you will not. The difference between those two groups has nothing to do with how big you are, how tough you think you are, or what kind of car your daddy bought you for graduation. He began walking up and down the ranks, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the recruits before him. When he stopped in front of Sarah, she could feel his gaze like a physical weight. "It has everything to do with how badly you want to be here," he continued, still staring at Sarah. "How much you're willing to sacrifice, how hard you're willing to work, and how deep you're willing to dig when everything in your body is telling you to quit." Sarah met his gaze steadily, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. She had come too far and sacrificed too much to be intimidated now, even by someone who could probably bench press her entire body weight. The drill sergeant moved on, but Sarah caught the briefest flicker of something in his expression that might have been approval. Or maybe she was imagining things. In the weeks to come, she would learn that drill sergeants were experts at hiding their true thoughts behind masks of professional intimidation. The first few days of basic training were a relentless blur of medical examinations, equipment distribution, and orientation sessions that seemed designed to overwhelm new recruits with information they couldn't possibly absorb all at once. Sarah found herself struggling to keep up physically with tasks that seemed routine to her larger, stronger counterparts. During the first physical training session, she finished the required run several minutes behind most of her platoon. Her push-ups were shaky, and her sit-ups barely met the minimum standard. The other recruits noticed, and some of them weren't shy about sharing their observations. "Martinez moves like she's afraid she'll break something," muttered Peterson, a former high school football player who seemed to view basic training as an extension of his athletic career. "Maybe she will," laughed Williams, another recruit who had been making increasingly loud comments about women in the military since their arrival. "Some people just aren't cut out for this kind of work." Sarah heard every word but kept her expression neutral as she focused on completing her exercises. She had expected skepticism and knew she would have to prove herself through actions rather than arguments. What surprised her was how much the doubt hurt, even when it came from people whose opinions shouldn't matter to her. That night, after lights out, Sarah lay in her narrow bunk and listened to the sounds of 30 other recruits trying to fall asleep in an unfamiliar environment. Some cried quietly into their pillows. Others snored loudly enough to wake the dead. A few whispered conversations with bunkmates about home, family, and whether they had made a terrible mistake. Sarah didn't cry, though she felt like it. Instead, she made a silent promise to herself that she would not be the weak link her appearance suggested she might be. She would find a way to meet every standard, pass every test, and prove that determination could overcome almost any physical disadvantage. She had no way of knowing that this promise would eventually lead her through 5 deployments, multiple combat zones, and a series of actions that would make her one of the most decorated soldiers of her generation. All she knew was that tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she intended to meet them head-on. The journey from overlooked recruit to decorated veteran was about to begin, and Sarah Martinez was finally ready to show the world what she was truly capable of achieving. The third week of basic training brought the first real test that would separate those who belonged from those who were just visiting. The obstacle course loomed ahead of Sarah's platoon like a medieval torture device designed by someone with a particularly cruel sense of humor. Rope climbs, wall scaling, crawling under barbed wire through mud, and a dozen other challenges that seemed specifically designed to exploit every physical weakness a person might possess. Sarah stood at the starting line, her stomach churning with a mixture of anxiety and determination. Around her, the larger recruits stretched and psyched themselves up with the confidence of people who had never doubted their own physical capabilities. She had been studying the course for days, memorizing every obstacle and working out strategies that might help her compensate for her size disadvantage. "Remember," called out Drill Sergeant Martinez, no relation, despite sharing a surname, "this isn't about being the fastest. This is about finishing." Everyone who quits gets to repeat this exercise until they either pass or pack their bags for home. The whistle shrieked, and Sarah launched herself forward with the desperate energy of someone who knew she couldn't afford to lose ground early. The first obstacle was a series of hurdles that were almost waist-high on her small frame. While other recruits bounded over them easily, Sarah had to practically vault each one, using every ounce of momentum she could generate. She fell behind immediately, but she had expected that. Her strategy wasn't about keeping pace early. It was about maintaining steady progress while others exhausted themselves try to show off. She watched Peterson attack the rope climb like he was wrestling a large snake, using brute force where technique would have been more efficient. He made it to the top quickly, but dropped down breathing heavily. When Sarah reached the rope, she used the J-hook technique she had practiced secretly during her free time, wrapping the rope around her leg to create a platform that took some of the weight off her arms. It was slower than Peterson's approach, but it was sustainable. She climbed steadily, hand over hand, focusing on her breathing and ignoring the burning sensation in her forearms. At the top, she paused for just a moment to look back at the ground below. It was higher than she had expected, and for a brief instant, vertigo made her grip the rope more tightly. Then, she controlled her descent, using the same technique that had carried her up. The wall-scaling obstacle almost defeated her. At 8 feet tall, it required recruits to pull themselves up and overusing nothing but upper body strength. Sarah watched 3 attempts by other recruits before her turn came, studying their techniques and looking for any advantage she could find. When her moment arrived, she approached the wall from a slight angle, giving herself a running start that let her grab the top edge with more momentum than a standing jump would have provided. Her first attempt failed when her grip slipped. Her second attempt got her halfway up before her arms gave out. "Martinez!" shouted Drill Sergeant Thompson, appearing beside the obstacle with the supernatural timing that all drill sergeants seemed to possess. "What's your problem?" "No excuse, Drill Sergeant," Sarah replied, the standard response to any question that seemed even remotely critical. "Are you quitting?" Sarah looked up at the wall that had just defeated her twice. Her arms felt like overcooked pasta, and her hands were scraped raw from the rough concrete surface. Every rational part of her brain suggested that maybe she should accept the fact that some obstacles were simply too much for someone her size. "No, Drill Sergeant," requesting permission to try again. Thompson stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable behind his wide-brimmed hat. "Permission granted. But if you fail again, you're repeating the entire course tomorrow." Sarah's third attempt was different. Instead of trying to muscle her way over the wall, she used her legs to walk up the surface while pulling with her arms, distributing the effort more evenly. It was awkward and probably looked ridiculous, but it worked. She hauled herself over the top and dropped down on the other side with a sense of triumph that was completely disproportionate to the actual achievement. The crawling obstacle was where Sarah finally found her advantage. The space under the barbed wire was tight, designed to force larger recruits to drag themselves forward on their bellies while staying as low as possible. Sarah's small frame allowed her to move through the space more efficiently than anyone else in her platoon. For the first time since starting the course, she passed several other recruits. The mud was cold and thick, grabbing at her uniform and making every movement more difficult. But Sarah had grown up helping her father in their small garden, and she wasn't afraid of getting dirty. She focused on maintaining steady forward progress, while others struggled with the psychological discomfort of being covered in filth. By the time she emerged from under the wire, she was only a few positions behind the middle of the pack. Her uniform was completely brown with mud. Her face was streaked with dirt, and she could feel grit between her teeth. She had never felt more accomplished in her entire life. The final obstacle was a balance beam, followed by a sprint to the finish line. Sarah had always been good with balance, a skill developed during years of walking on curbs and playground equipment. She moved across the beam quickly and confidently, passing 2 more recruits who were struggling with their footing. When she crossed the finish line, she was breathing hard but not gasping. More importantly, she had finished in the middle third of her platoon, a result that exceeded everyone's expectations, including her own. She had proven something important to herself, and perhaps more significantly, to the drill sergeants who would be evaluating her potential over the coming weeks. "Not bad, Martinez," said Drill Sergeant Thompson as she reported her completion. "Room for improvement, but not bad." Coming from him, it was practically a glowing review. Sarah tried to keep her expression neutral, but inside she was celebrating. She had passed her first major test and proven that size wasn't everything in determining military capability. The weeks that followed brought new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself. Marksmanship training revealed that Sarah had exceptional hand-eye coordination and the patience needed to excel with weapons. While other recruits struggled with the fundamentals of breathing and trigger control, Sarah's shots consistently hit their targets with precision that surprised her instructors. "Martinez, where did you learn to shoot?" asked Staff Sergeant Williams during a particularly impressive performance on the rifle range. "I didn't, Staff Sergeant. First time holding a weapon." Williams looked at her target through his binoculars and shook his head. "Natural ability like this doesn't come along very often. Are you interested in additional marksmanship training?" Sarah's heart leaped. "Yes, Staff Sergeant. Very much." The additional training sessions took place during what would have been free time for other recruits. Sarah spent hours learning advanced techniques, studying ballistics, and practicing with different weapon systems. She discovered that she had an intuitive understanding of trajectory and wind effects that normally took months of training to develop. Her newfound expertise on the rifle range earned her respect from recruits who had previously dismissed her as too small to be effective. Peterson, who had been one of her most vocal critics, actually asked for her advice during a particularly difficult qualification exercise. "How do you make it look so easy?" he asked, genuinely curious rather than condescending. Sarah thought about her answer carefully. "I think it's about patience. Most people want to rush the shot, but the weapon will tell you when it's ready if you listen to it." Peterson nodded thoughtfully and tried to apply her advice during his next string of fire. His performance improved immediately, and word began to spread that Martinez actually knew what she was talking about when it came to weapons. The transformation in how others perceived her was gradual, but unmistakable. Instead of being seen as the weak link who might not make it through training, she became known as someone who approached challenges differently, but effectively. Her study habits, which had seemed obsessive to some recruits, started being copied by others who wanted to improve their test scores. During tactical exercises, Sarah's small size became an asset rather than a liability. She could move through terrain that forced larger soldiers to find alternative routes. Her quiet nature made her excellent at reconnaissance tasks that required patience and attention to detail. Most importantly, she had developed a reputation for never giving up, no matter how difficult the circumstances became. The night infiltration exercise was where Sarah truly began to shine. The mission required recruits to navigate through a wooded area in complete darkness, avoid detection by instructors playing enemy forces, and reach a designated objective within a specific time limit. Many recruits relied on moving quickly and hoping their size would intimidate any opponents they encountered. Sarah took a different approach. She moved slowly and deliberately, using her natural ability to remain quiet and her growing understanding of military tactics. She avoided the obvious routes that other recruits were taking and instead found paths that were more difficult but less likely to be monitored. When she encountered an instructor position that was blocking her planned route, she didn't try to force her way through. Instead, she settled into a concealed position and waited, watching their patrol pattern until she identified a gap that would allow her to pass undetected. Her patience paid off when the instructors shifted their position slightly, creating exactly the opening she needed. Sarah was the third recruit to reach the objective, despite being one of the smallest and physically weakest members of her platoon. More importantly, she was one of only 5 recruits who managed to complete the exercise without being detected by any of the opposing forces. "Outstanding work, Martinez," said Captain Rodriguez during the after-action review. "Your approach showed real tactical thinking. Have you considered applying for advanced infantry training? The question caught Sarah off guard. Advanced infantry training was typically reserved for recruits who showed exceptional promise in combat-related skills. It was also a pathway that could lead to specialized units and more challenging assignments than standard military occupational specialties. I'd be honored to be considered, sir, she replied. We'll talk more about it after graduation. Keep up the good work. As basic training entered its final weeks, Sarah had completely transformed from the uncertain young woman who had stepped off the bus 2 months earlier. She had gained muscle mass, improved her cardiovascular fitness, and developed confidence in her ability to handle military challenges. More importantly, she had earned the respect of her peers and the attention of her instructors. The final physical fitness test was Sarah's last chance to prove that her transformation was complete. The requirements had seemed impossible when she first arrived, but months of training had prepared her for this moment. She needed to pass the push-up and sit-up requirements and complete the 2-mile run within the time limit for her age group. The push-ups went better than expected. Sarah had focused intensely on upper body strength training, often staying after required PT sessions to work on her weaknesses. She completed the minimum requirement and managed several additional repetitions before her form broke down. Sit-ups had always been one of her strengths, and she passed that portion easily. The 2-mile run would be the real test. She had improved significantly since her first attempt, but the time standard was still challenging for someone with her shorter stride length. Sarah started the run conservatively, settling into a pace she knew she could maintain. Other recruits sprinted ahead, trying to build an early lead, but she had learned to trust her own strategy over the months of training. The key was to avoid exhaustion in the early stages while gradually increasing her pace as the run progressed. At the halfway point, she was right on pace for the time she needed. Her breathing was controlled, and her legs felt strong. Around her, some of the recruits who had started fast were beginning to struggle with the pace they had set for themselves. The final half-mile was where Sarah's mental toughness made the difference. Her body wanted to slow down, but she had learned to push through discomfort in ways she never could have imagined before basic training. She picked up her pace slightly, passing 2 recruits who were fading badly. When she crossed the finish line, the stopwatch showed she had beaten the required time by nearly 30 seconds. It wasn't a spectacular performance, but it represented everything she had accomplished over the past 10 weeks. She had met every standard the Army had set for her and proven that determination could overcome almost any initial disadvantage. Graduation day arrived with a mixture of pride and anticipation that Sarah had never experienced before. Her parents had flown in from Los Angeles, their faces glowing with pride as they watched their daughter receive recognition for her achievements. Her father wore his best suit, and her mother clutched a small American flag that she waved enthusiastically during the ceremony. Private Martinez called out the company commander as he presented her with a certificate recognizing her marksmanship achievements. Congratulations on your outstanding performance during basic training. The Army needs more soldiers with your dedication and skill. After the ceremony, Sarah's drill sergeants gathered the graduating recruits for final words of advice. Drill Sergeant Thompson, who had seemed so intimidating on their first day, actually smiled as he addressed the group. You came here as civilians, he said. You're leaving as soldiers. Some of you exceeded our expectations. Some of you barely met them. But all of you proved that you have what it takes to serve your country with honor. His eyes found Sarah in the crowd. Remember that your training is just beginning. Basic training taught you how to be soldiers. Your next assignments will teach you how to be warriors. Stay humble, keep learning, and never forget that your fellow soldiers are depending on you to be at your best when it matters most. Sarah's next assignment would take her to Fort Bragg for advanced infantry training, the first step in a military career that would eventually lead to multiple combat deployments and actions that would test every skill she had learned. But on graduation day, surrounded by family and fellow soldiers, she was simply a young woman who had proven that she belonged in a world where she had initially seemed out of place. The girl who had looked like a greenhorn had become a soldier. Soon, she would have the chance to become something even more extraordinary. The transport plane shuddered as it descended through the thick clouds over Afghanistan, and Sarah Martinez felt her stomach drop along with the aircraft. 6 months of advanced infantry training at Fort Bragg had prepared her for this moment, but no amount of simulation could replicate the reality of approaching an active combat zone for the first time. Around her, 30 other soldiers sat in the red-lit cargo bay, their faces a mixture of determination and barely concealed anxiety. Some veterans of previous deployments dozed fitfully despite the turbulence, while newer soldiers like Sarah gripped their equipment bags and tried to look more confident than they felt. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, Sarah's team leader, leaned over and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear him above the engine noise. "Remember your training, Martinez. The people shooting at us don't care how big you are or where you came from. They only care that you're wearing an American flag on your shoulder." Sarah nodded, checking her weapon for the 100th time during the flight. The M4 carbine felt familiar in her hands now. After months of intensive training that had built on the natural marksmanship ability she had discovered in basic training. She could field strip it blindfolded, clear malfunctions instinctively, and put rounds on target at distances that impressed even seasoned instructors. The plane touched down at Bagram Airfield with a jarring impact that rattled every bolt in the aircraft. Through the small windows, Sarah caught her first glimpse of Afghanistan. A landscape of brown mountains, dusty valleys, and scattered buildings that looked like they had been carved from the earth itself. The air that rushed in when the cargo door opened was thin and dry, carrying scents of dust, fuel, and something else she couldn't identify, but would later recognize as the smell of a country at war. "Welcome to the sandbox," called out Staff Sergeant Williams, a veteran of 2 previous deployments who had been assigned to help orient the new arrivals. "First rule, everything here can kill you. The weather, the terrain, the food, the water, and definitely the people who don't want us here. Second rule, your training will keep you alive if you remember to use it." The base processing took 3 days of briefings, equipment checks, and acclimatization exercises designed to help new arrivals adjust to the altitude and climate. Sarah absorbed every detail she could, knowing that information might mean the difference between life and death in the weeks ahead. She studied maps of the local area, memorized enemy tactics and capabilities, and practiced radio procedures until they became second nature. Her first patrol came on a Tuesday morning, a routine mission to check on a village that had been reporting increased Taliban activity in the surrounding hills. Sarah was assigned as the automatic rifleman for her squad, carrying an M249 squad automatic weapon that was nearly as tall as she was and weighed almost 30 pounds when fully loaded. "You sure you can handle that thing?" asked Specialist Johnson, one of the squad members who had been deployed for 4 months already. "No shame in carrying a standard rifle until you get used to the environment." Sarah adjusted the sling on her weapon and looked Johnson in the eye. "I can handle it." The patrol route took them through a series of small villages connected by dirt roads that had been carved into the mountainside decades earlier. The landscape was beautiful in a harsh way, with snow-capped peaks rising above valleys that looked like they had been painted in shades of brown and gold. But Sarah quickly learned to see the terrain through tactical eyes, identifying potential ambush sites and escape routes wherever they went. The villagers they encountered were polite but cautious, offering tea and information in carefully measured amounts that suggested they had learned to survive by avoiding taking sides in conflicts they couldn't control. Children followed the patrol at a distance, their curiosity overcoming their wariness as they pointed at the strange soldiers and whispered among themselves. "They're good people," explained Sergeant Rodriguez during a rest halt. "Most of them just want to be left alone to farm their land and raise their families. But the Taliban doesn't give them much choice about cooperation, and they know we can't stay here to protect them after we leave." It was a complex situation that had no easy answers, and Sarah began to understand why so many veterans struggled to explain their experiences to people who had never served in combat zones. The reality of counterinsurgency warfare was nothing like the clear-cut scenarios they had trained for, where enemies wore uniforms and objectives were straightforward. The attack came during their 3rd patrol, 2 weeks after Sarah's arrival in country. The squad was returning from a meeting with village elders when the first shots cracked out from a ridgeline about 300 meters away. Sarah heard the distinctive snap of bullets passing overhead and immediately dropped into the prone position she had practiced thousands of times in training. "Contact left," shouted Sergeant Rodriguez. 2 o'clock, ridgeline. Sarah could see muzzle flashes among the rocks where the enemy fighters had positioned themselves. Her training took over automatically as she deployed the bipod legs on her machine gun and oriented toward the threat. The weapon bucked against her shoulder as she fired short bursts, trying to suppress the enemy position while her squad maneuvered for better cover. "Martinez, keep their heads down," Rodriguez ordered through the radio. "We're moving to flank them." The M249 was designed for exactly this kind of situation, providing sustained fire that would force enemy fighters to take cover instead of aiming carefully at moving soldiers. Sarah fed a new belt of ammunition into the weapon and continued firing measured bursts, watching her tracer rounds arc toward the rocks where the muzzle flashes had appeared. The firefight lasted 20 minutes, though it felt like hours to Sarah. She went through 400 rounds of ammunition, calling out target locations to her squad mates and adjusting her fire based on their movements. When the enemy fighters finally broke contact and disappeared into the mountainous terrain, Sarah realized she was shaking slightly from adrenaline. "Good work, Martinez," said Rodriguez as they conducted a quick assessment of their situation. "Your fire kept them pinned down while we got into position. That's exactly what we needed." It was Sarah's first time being shot at, and her first time shooting back at people who were trying to kill her. The experience was simultaneously terrifying and oddly routine, as if all her training had been preparing her for exactly this moment. She had performed well under fire, but she also understood that this was just the beginning of what would be a long deployment filled with similar encounters. The weeks that followed brought a steady escalation in enemy activity throughout their area of operations. Sarah's squad found themselves conducting patrols almost daily, responding to reports of insurgent activity and trying to maintain security for local villages that were caught between coalition forces and Taliban fighters. Sarah's reputation as a reliable soldier grew with each mission. Her small size allowed her to move through terrain that was difficult for larger soldiers, and her marksmanship skills made her valuable in both offensive and defensive operations. More importantly, she had proven that she could remain calm under fire and make good decisions when lives were at stake. During a nighttime raid on a suspected weapons cache, Sarah was chosen to provide overwatch security while the rest of her squad searched a compound. She positioned herself on a rooftop with a clear view of the surrounding area and settled in to watch for any signs of enemy movement. 2 hours into the mission, Sarah spotted 3 figures moving through the darkness toward the compound. They were trying to stay concealed, using shadows and terrain features to mask their approach, but her night vision equipment revealed their movements clearly. "Bravo 6, this is Martinez," she whispered into her radio. "I have 3 military-age males approaching from the east. They're carrying what looks like weapons. Copy, Martinez. Are they a threat to the search team?" Sarah watched the figures carefully, tracking their movements and trying to determine their intentions. They had stopped about 50 meters from the compound and appear to be setting up some kind of equipment. "They're emplacing something," she reported. "Looks like they might be setting up for an ambush. Take them out if you have a clear shot." Sarah had been hoping she wouldn't receive that order, but she understood the tactical situation. If the enemy fighters were allowed to complete their setup, they could attack the search team when they emerged from the compound. Her squad mates were depending on her to eliminate the threat. She settled into her shooting position, controlled her breathing, and acquired her targets through her rifle scope. The range was about 100 meters, well within her capabilities even in low-light conditions. She fired 3 carefully aimed shots in rapid succession, watching each target fall before shifting to the next one. "Target's down," she reported, her voice steady despite the way her hands were shaking. "Area is clear." It was the first time Sarah had killed enemy fighters, and the psychological impact was more complex than she had expected. She felt relief that her squad mates were safe, satisfaction that her training had proven effective, and a strange emptiness that she couldn't quite identify. Taking human lives, even in combat, was a responsibility that weighed heavily on soldiers regardless of how necessary it might be tactically. The mission was considered a success, yielding intelligence that led to several other operations against insurgent networks in the region. Sarah's actions had directly saved the lives of her fellow soldiers, and her squad leader recommended her for a commendation that recognized her courage under fire. But the real test came 3 weeks later, during an operation that would change everything about how Sarah viewed her role as a soldier. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value target was meeting with local insurgent leaders in a village about 10 kilometers from their forward operating base. Sarah's squad was assigned to provide security for a special operations team that would conduct the actual capture mission. The plan seemed straightforward: surround the village, prevent enemy escape routes, and provide backup if the special operations team encountered resistance. Sarah was positioned with her machine gun at a checkpoint that controlled the main road leading out of the village. Everything went wrong almost immediately. The intelligence was faulty, and instead of finding a single high-value target, the special operations team walked into a gathering of more than 20 heavily armed insurgent fighters. The resulting firefight was intense and chaotic, with enemy fire coming from multiple buildings throughout the village. "All units, we are taking heavy contact," came the urgent radio call from the special operations team leader. "We need immediate support." Sarah could hear the gunfire erupting from the village center, the distinctive sounds of different weapons mixing into a continuous roar of combat. Her position gave her a clear view of the main road, but she couldn't see the actual fighting or help her fellow soldiers who were pinned down. Then, she spotted a technical vehicle, a pickup truck mounted with a heavy machine gun, racing toward her checkpoint. The enemy fighters in the truck had obviously decided to break out of the village rather than continue fighting in the urban environment where they were outnumbered. Sarah had about 10 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether the enemy fighters escaped to fight another day or were stopped before they could threaten other coalition forces. The technical vehicle was moving fast, and her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. She swung her machine gun toward the approaching threat and opened fire, sending a stream of bullets toward the engine compartment and driver's area. The truck swerved wildly as her rounds impacted the front end, but it kept coming toward her position. Sarah adjusted her aim and fired another long burst, this time targeting the heavy machine gun mounted in the truck bed. She could see sparks flying as her bullets struck metal, and suddenly, the enemy weapon went silent. The truck veered off the road and crashed into a stone wall about 50 meters from her position. "Martinez, are you okay?" came Rodriguez's voice over the radio. "I'm fine," she replied, though her heart was pounding so hard she could barely think straight. "Enemy technical is down." The firefight in the village continued for another hour before the insurgent fighters were either killed or captured. When it was over, Sarah's squad conducted a battle damage assessment that revealed the extent of what had taken place. The special operations team had been outnumbered 4-1, and several coalition soldiers had been wounded during the engagement. Sarah's actions at the checkpoint had prevented a significant number of enemy fighters from escaping to conduct future attacks. More importantly, the heavy weapons in the technical vehicle could have been used to attack the special operations team from behind, potentially turning a difficult situation into a complete disaster. "Outstanding work, Martinez," said Captain Thompson when he arrived to debrief the mission. "Your quick thinking and accurate fire prevented what could have been a much worse situation." It was the first time Sarah truly understood the weight of responsibility that came with being a soldier in combat. Her training had prepared her to handle weapons and tactics, but nothing could have prepared her for the knowledge that other people's lives depended on her ability to make split-second decisions under extreme stress. The recommendation for her first Purple Heart would come 2 weeks later, after an improvised explosive device damaged her patrol vehicle and left her with a concussion and shrapnel wounds that required medical treatment. But The injury that earned her the medal was less significant than the psychological wounds that came from months of continuous combat operations. Sarah was learning that being a soldier meant more than just following orders and completing missions. It meant carrying the weight of decisions that affected other people's lives, living with the knowledge that mistakes could be fatal, and finding ways to maintain your humanity in situations that seemed designed to strip it away. Her deployment was only halfway finished, and already she was becoming someone very different from the uncertain young woman who had stepped off the transport plane 6 months earlier. The trials ahead would test every aspect of her character and prove that courage came in many different forms. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez stood in the pre-dawn darkness outside the forward operating base, checking her equipment one final time before what would become the most important mission of her military career. For years, and 3 deployments had transformed her from an uncertain recruit into a seasoned non-commissioned officer who commanded the respect of every soldier under her leadership. Her second Purple Heart had come during her first deployment, when an IED blast left her with temporary hearing loss and a scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw. The third had been earned in Iraq, where shrapnel from a mortar round had torn through her body armor and left her with wounds that took months to fully heal. The fourth came from a sniper's bullet that had grazed her shoulder during a particularly intense firefight in Syria. Each injury had been accompanied by opportunities to return home, to accept medical discharge, and transition to civilian life with full benefits and the thanks of a grateful nation. Each time, Sarah had chosen to recover and return to active duty, driven by a sense of responsibility to the soldiers who served under her, and the missions that still needed to be completed. Now, at 27, she was preparing for what intelligence reports suggested would be her most dangerous assignment yet. A group of American hostages, including 2 female aid workers and a military contractor, had been taken by a terrorist cell operating in the mountains along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. The rescue mission would require a small team to infiltrate enemy territory, locate the hostages, and extract them before they could be moved to a more secure location. Sarah had been selected to lead a 12-person special operations team because of her unique combination of combat experience, leadership ability, and tactical expertise. The mission planners had specifically requested her involvement, knowing that her small stature and proven ability to operate in difficult terrain would be crucial for the success of the operation. "Bravo team, gather around," Sarah called quietly to her soldiers. They approached without speaking, their movements precise and professional despite the early hour and the weight of their equipment. These were some of the best soldiers in the Army, veterans of multiple deployments who had volunteered for an assignment that everyone understood might be a one-way trip. Intelligence indicates the hostages are being held in a compound approximately 40 kilometers from here, Sarah briefed them, using a satellite map to show the target location. The area is heavily defended, with an estimated 30 to 40 enemy fighters distributed between the main compound and several observation posts throughout the valley. She paused to let that information sink in. Their 12-person team would be outnumbered at least 3-1, operating in terrain that favored the defenders. Success would depend on surprise, superior training, and the kind of tactical brilliance that could only be developed through years of combat experience. "Our approach will take us through this ravine system," Sarah continued, tracing their planned route with her finger. "It provides concealment from observation, but it also limits our escape routes if things go wrong. We'll have to move fast once we're detected, because we won't have backup arriving anytime soon." Sergeant First Class Johnson, Sarah's most experienced squad leader, studied the map carefully. "What's the timeline for exfiltration?" "Helicopter pickup is scheduled for 0300 hours at this landing zone." Sarah pointed to a spot about 2 kilometers from the target compound. "If we miss that window, we're walking out through 40 kilometers of hostile territory." The weight of that statement hung in the air. Everyone understood what it meant to be stranded in enemy territory without support, carrying wounded hostages who might not be able to keep up with the pace necessary to avoid capture. "Any questions?" Sarah asked. There were none. These soldiers had trained for exactly this kind of mission, and they trusted their leader's judgment completely. Sarah had earned that trust through 3 years of combat operations that had proven her tactical abilities and her commitment to bringing every soldier home alive. The infiltration began at midnight, with Sarah leading her team through terrain that seemed specifically designed to test human endurance. The ravine system was filled with loose rocks that threatened to create noise with every step, thorny vegetation that caught on equipment and clothing, and steep sections that required rope assistance to navigate safely. Sarah moved like a ghost through the darkness, using night vision equipment to pick the safest route while maintaining the rapid pace necessary to reach their objective on schedule. Behind her, 11 other soldiers followed in single file, trusting her navigation skills completely as they moved deeper into territory controlled by people who would show no mercy if they were captured. 3 hours into the movement, Sarah held up her hand to signal a halt. Through her night vision scope, she had spotted 2 enemy sentries positioned on a ridgeline overlooking their route. The sentries were smoking cigarettes and talking quietly, but their location would give them a clear view of any movement through the ravine below. Sarah motioned for her team to take cover while she studied the situation. The sentries had to be eliminated quietly, without alerting other enemy positions that might be monitoring radio communications. She selected Corporal Williams, her best marksman, and Sergeant Davis, who had specialized training in close-quarters combat. The 2 soldiers moved like shadows up the steep slope, using terrain features to mask their approach. Sarah watched through her scope as they positioned themselves within striking distance of the enemy sentries. A few minutes later, she saw the brief flash of movement that indicated the threat had been eliminated. Bravo 6, this is Williams. Area secure. Sarah led her team through the cleared checkpoint and continued toward their objective, now only 5 kilometers away from the compound where the hostages were being held. The final approach would be the most dangerous part of the mission, requiring them to cross open terrain that was overlooked by multiple enemy positions. As they crested a small hill that provided their first view of the target area, Sarah felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. Intelligence reports had been accurate about the compound's location, but they had underestimated the number of enemy fighters present. She could see at least 6 guard positions, and thermal imaging revealed additional personnel moving throughout the buildings. "Looks like we're going to have company," whispered Johnson, who was positioned beside her with a sniper rifle. Sarah studied the compound layout through her binoculars, identifying the building where the hostages were most likely being held based on the guard positions and the intelligence they had received. It was a 2-story structure in the center of the compound, with clear fields of fire in all directions and multiple exit routes for the defenders. "We'll split into 3 teams," Sarah decided. "Johnson, take your squad and establish overwatch positions on the ridge. Williams, your team will create a diversion at the front gate. My team will breach the main building and extract the hostages." It was a plan that required precise timing and flawless execution. If any element failed to perform their assigned role, the entire mission could collapse into a chaotic firefight that would endanger both the rescue team and the hostages they were trying to save. "Remember," Sarah said as her soldiers prepared for the assault, "our primary objective is to get those hostages out alive. Everything else is secondary. If you have to choose between completing your assigned task and saving an American life, save the life." The assault began at exactly 0200 hours. Johnson's sniper team eliminated the perimeter guards with suppressed weapons, creating gaps in the defensive perimeter that would allow the assault teams to approach undetected. Williams' diversion team set off explosives at the front gate, drawing enemy attention away from the main building where Sarah's team was preparing to breach. Sarah led her 4-person team through a gap in the compound wall and moved quickly toward their objective. The sound of gunfire from the front gate filled the air, masking the noise of their movement as they approached the building where intelligence indicated the hostages were being held. The breach was textbook perfect. Sergeant Davis placed explosive charges on the door, while Sarah and her other 2 soldiers positioned themselves to enter immediately after the blast. When the charges detonated, Sarah was the first person through the door, her weapon ready, and her eyes scanning for threats. She found herself in a room with 6 enemy fighters who were just beginning to react to the explosion. Training took over completely as Sarah engaged multiple targets in rapid succession, her muscle memory allowing her to aim and fire without conscious thought. Behind her, her team members were doing the same thing, clearing the room with the mechanical precision that came from years of practice. "Clear," Sarah called out as the last enemy fighter fell. Moving to the second floor, the stairway to the upper level was narrow and exposed, offering no cover if enemy fighters were waiting above. Sarah moved up the stairs quickly, knowing that hesitation would only give the defenders time to prepare. At the top, she found a hallway with 3 doors, any one of which could contain the hostages or additional enemy fighters. "Martinez, we're running out of time," came Johnson's voice over the radio. "Heavy enemy reinforcements approaching from the east. You got maybe 10 minutes before this place is crawling with hostiles." Sarah made rapid decisions about which rooms to clear first, based on intelligence briefings and her tactical instincts. The first room contained communications equipment and maps, valuable intelligence, but not what they were looking for. The second room was empty except for weapons and ammunition. The third room was where she found them. 2 women and 1 man, all Americans, bound and sitting against the far wall. They looked terrified but uninjured, their eyes wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief as armed soldiers suddenly appeared in their prison. "We're here to get you out," Sarah said calmly as she cut their restraints. "Stay close and do exactly what I tell you. We're going to move fast." The extraction was where everything almost went wrong. As Sarah's team moved toward their planned escape route with the rescued hostages, they encountered a patrol of enemy fighters who had been responding to the explosions at the front gate. The resulting firefight was intense and chaotic, with bullets flying in all directions while Sarah tried to protect 3 civilians who had no combat training. "Get down," Sarah shouted to the hostages as enemy rounds cracked overhead. She returned fire while moving toward better cover, trying to suppress the enemy position while her team maneuvered for advantage. It was during this firefight that Sarah was wounded for the 5th and final time. An enemy grenade exploded close enough to knock her to the ground and fill her left leg with shrapnel. The pain was immediate and intense, but she forced herself to keep moving because stopping would mean death for everyone under her protection. "Martinez is hit," called out Corporal Thompson, who had seen her go down. "I'm fine," Sarah replied through gritted teeth, though she could feel blood filling her boot and her leg was beginning to lose strength. "Keep moving toward the extract point." The final kilometer to the helicopter landing zone was a running battle that tested every aspect of Sarah's leadership and her team's training. Enemy fighters pursued them through rocky terrain that made movement difficult even for healthy, uninjured soldiers. Sarah hobbled forward on her wounded leg while directing her team's defensive actions and ensuring the safety of the rescued hostages. When they finally reached the landing zone, Sarah could hear the helicopter approaching through the darkness. But she could also hear enemy vehicles racing toward their position, and she knew they would have to fight to hold the area until the aircraft could land and take off again. "Defensive positions," Sarah ordered. "They're going to try to stop us from getting out." Her soldiers spread out around a landing zone and prepared for what might be their final battle. Sarah positioned herself where she could direct their defensive fire while staying close enough to the hostages to protect them if enemy fighters broke through their perimeter. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and engine noise just as the first enemy vehicles appeared on the surrounding ridgelines. Sarah's team laid down suppressive fire while the aircrew helped load the rescued hostages into the aircraft. Enemy bullets sparked off the helicopter's armor plating, and Sarah knew they had only seconds before the situation became completely untenable. "Get them out of here," Sarah shouted to the pilot, pushing the last hostage toward the aircraft door. "What about you?" the pilot shouted back. Sarah looked around at her soldiers, who were still fighting to hold their positions against increasing enemy pressure. 2 of her team members had been wounded, and they were running low on ammunition. Getting everyone out would require someone to stay behind and buy time. Go, Sarah ordered. That's a direct order. The pilot hesitated for a moment, then lifted off with the rescued hostages while Sarah and her team continued their fighting withdrawal toward a secondary extraction 0.2 kilometers away. It would be the longest 2 kilometers of their lives, but every one of her soldiers made it out alive. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood at attention in the Pentagon while the Secretary of Defense pinned her 5th Purple Heart to her dress uniform. Around her stood the families of the hostages she had rescued, the members of her team who had shared the mission, and senior military leaders who understood the significance of what had been accomplished. Staff Sergeant Martinez, the secretary said in a voice that carried throughout the ceremony hall, "Your actions during this rescue mission reflect the highest traditions of military service and personal courage. You have honored your uniform, your unit, and your country." Sarah's parents were in the front row, their faces glowing with the same pride they had shown at her basic training graduation years earlier. Her father wore the same suit he had worn that day, and her mother still clutched a small American flag, though now it was worn from being carried to multiple ceremonies honoring their daughter's service. After the ceremony, reporters asked Sarah what drove her to continue serving despite multiple wounds and opportunities to leave the military. Her answer was simple and came from the heart. Every soldier who serves does so because they believe in something bigger than themselves. For me, that something is the idea that Americans don't leave other Americans behind, no matter what the cost. As long as there are people who need help and missions that need to be completed, I'll be ready to serve. Sarah Martinez had traveled a long journey from the uncertain young woman who had stood in that recruiting station years earlier. She had proven that courage came in all sizes and that determination could overcome almost any obstacle. Most importantly, she had shown that the greatest heroes are often those who look least like what people expect heroes to look like. Her 5 Purple Hearts represented more than just wounds received in combat. They represented a level of commitment to service that few people could understand and fewer still could match. They were proof that sometimes the people who seem least likely to succeed are exactly the ones who will surprise everyone, including themselves, with what they can accomplish when everything is on the line. Years later, when Sarah finally retired from the military with the rank of Command Sergeant Major, she would be remembered as one of the most decorated soldiers of her generation. But she would always think of herself as that small, determined young woman who had refused to let anyone else's expectations define what she could achieve. The girl who had looked like a greenhorn had become a legend, and her story would inspire countless others to push beyond their perceived limitations and discover what they were truly capable of accomplishing when they refused to give up on their dreams.